I'm married. Modern marriage has a lot to recommend it. I do also think it is a patriarchal institution. It is literally...
Of course you think that,
well,
because you think virtually everything that occurs in our society is a patriarchal institution. And it's easy to think that because then you only have to think one thing. You have a one-thing answer for everything.
You could let
it's part of the patriarchal institution.
I don't think you're obeying the rule that says maybe treat people as if they have something worth hearing. So
I'm not making a case for the patriarchal tyranny. And I don't think you are either. I think that you're making a case that's like a universally cliched case for the patriarchal tyranny. I don't see too much of you reflected in your articles at all.
Why do women change their names on marriage traditionally?
I don't know exactly. Why do you think they do?
Because it was to symbolize the transfer of their ownership from one family to another family. That's why in The Handmaid's Tale you have off Warren, off Glenn.
Oh God, Margaret Atwood. Well, she was just about devoured by the feminists last year, so that was something interesting to observe.
I think she made a very good point. She wasn't devoured by all feminists. I'm a feminist. I thought what she said about due process in cases like that is perfectly reasonable.
Mm-hmm. Well, many people didn't.
No, but then, guess what? This is on the internet. You can find someone who disagrees with pretty much anything. Mm-hmm. But so why do you think women change their names when they get married traditionally? If it's not about transfer of property ownership traditionally?
I don't know if I have an opinion about that. The specific reasons for that, I'd have to look into it for a fair amount of time before I decided it. But I certainly wouldn't boil it down to a unidimensional argument about the ownership of women by men. So,
okay.
I mean, the part of the problem too is with this sort of discussion is that and this is why I consider it a manifestation of ideological possession. It's predictable.
Well, that's what...
knowing your stance on...
But having a coherent ideology does mean that it is predictable, because
you don't need an ideology.
It is one logical thing that flows from another, and all those pieces tessellate together. So what I find very interesting about your thinking, I find it quite slightly baffling, is that I don't really see how all the pieces fit together. You say that you're not, you believe in God, but there's a lot of emphasis about going back to...
No, I actually say I act as if God exists.
Right. But,
which is actually my definition of belief.
Okay, but that then doesn't, to me, tessellate very obviously with your insistence that actually it's just about pure science, and there's not a because I can
what insistence that it's just about pure science?
Well,
I wrote Maps of Meaning. There's no insistence in that it's just about pure science.
Okay, but you make appeals to science.
What I mean is, different.
You make appeals to science all the time. You say, well, this is what the literature says, and the trouble with God is that ultimately you can't say this is what the literature says. There is no literature.
Which is why I don't say anything about the scientific status of God, apart from what can be experienced maybe under certain conditions of what would you call chemical-induced mysticism, which seems to be something that you can say something scientifically about. But I see that there's two different realms, right? There's a realm of values and a realm of facts. And in the realm of facts, science reigns supreme. But it doesn't in the realm of values. You have to look elsewhere. That was what the humanities were for, before they got, what would you say, hijacked by ideologues. And the idea that something should be consistent. You were talking about the necessity for consistency in ideology. It's like, I'm not hearing what you think. I'm hearing how you're able to represent the ideology you were taught. And it's not that interesting, because I don't know anything about you. I could replace you with someone else who thinks the same way. And that means you're not here. That's what it means. It's not pleasant. So you're not integrating the specifics of your personal experience with what you've been taught to synthesize something that's genuine and surprising and engaging in a narrative sense as a consequence. And that's the pathology of ideological possession. It's not good. And it's not good that I know where you stand on things. Once I know a few things, it's like, why have a conversation? I already know where you stand on things.
I bet you don't know where I stand on all things.
I would hope that was true.
Okay, let's talk about transgender issues. That's fun. What do you think I think about transgender issues?
I suspect that you think that gender expression, gender identity are fundamentally social constructs, but I could be wrong.
No, I believe that there are definitely some biological differences between the sexes. We've observed them. I do believe that gender is a hugely powerful social structure that we've built on top of that it is largely, but not entirely, socially constructed. I think when you look back through the history, biological differences have consistently shrunk, like we were talking in the 18th...
They haven't in Scandinavia, they've magnified.
Okay, but we were talking in the
That's actually an important exception, because Scandinavia has gone farther than any other area, the Scandinavian countries, in establishing egalitarian social policy. And the differences in interest and career choice and personality between men and women have grown as a consequence, not shrunk, which is exactly the opposite of what the social constructionists predicted.
But also just suggests that they're malleable, actually, rather than fixed.
Well, of course they're malleable. No one would ever suggest otherwise.
Right. So that's what I mean. So I think
they're
it's a
not
blended
malleable in the direction that the social constructionists presume. As you flatten out the sociological landscape, you maximize the biological differences. No one saw that coming. And you might think, well, it's a handful of right-wing scientists who are pushing that. It's like, no, it's not. It's mainstream psychology, and there aren't any radical right-wingers in mainstream psychology. And everyone who discovered that was absolutely shocked by it. And these papers have been cited by thousands of people, and they have tens of thousands of subjects, and they've been done on virtually national level samples, cross-culturally.
But I also think the behaviour in Scandinavia has changed. For example, a lot more men take paternity leave now, that there is a portion that is reserved purely for men. That doesn't seem to be making them wildly unhappy. So I think that there are definitely behavioural things that are susceptible to nudges by society, by government and by the state, and that do change the way that people behave.
Yeah, that seems
so we can kind
plausible.
of meet in the middle on that one.
We know that people can be educated and that we can develop as a consequence of learning. That's certainly not a disputable proposition.
And I also believe that there is no evidence for gender identity in the way that it is used as an idea of a soul. I think that that's the way that it's often used to me.
By who?
By transgender activists.
Yes, well,
I think talk about having a female soul, and that to me seems strange. I don't see how you can
something like biological determinism,
right?
Which one of the things that's so perversely amusing about these sorts of arguments is that, well, but I attribute it to the lack of demand for logical consistency as a consequence of postmodern thinking. You can believe one thing when it's convenient in one situation and another thing when it's convenient for another. So we're in the perverse position where if you're a man born in a woman's body, that's biologically determined. But if you're a woman born in a woman's body, that's socially constructed. It's like, okay, good luck with that theory.
Right. I don't believe you can be a man born in a woman's body or a woman born in a man's body. What I believe is that there are some people who feel alienation towards their bodies and they want to remove body
everybody
parts.
Feels that.
Right, but they feel it to such an extent that clinically the best treatment for them is to transition and live as if they were the other sex.
Yeah, well, I don't think that there's any evidence that that's clinically the best treatment. We certainly don't know enough to make that presupposition, and I think we're playing with fire assuming that that's the case. The long-term outcome studies certainly don't demonstrate that. So it's not so.
I would make a very big distinction there between adults and between children. I think
that would be a good distinction to make.
Right,
yeah.
But I think we are very quick to diagnose and treat children in a way that I find, and not waiting for the research, and that I find concerning.
Yeah. So, well, the lawsuits will put an end to that in about 15 years.
So there's one place that we have found from which that is something that gets me a lot of hate, right?
I'm sure it does.
A turf and a bigot for that. So
right.
I don't think that's something that you would have been able to predict, that I think, because that is not now the orthodox feminist position.
I agree completely.
Oh, isn't that good?
So congratulations.
We've all learned something.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to talk quickly about Me Too movement.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me your reaction to what's unfolded over the last year. I won't put words in your mouth. You tell me.
Well, there's certainly no shortage of evidence for reprehensible sexual behavior on the part of people who can use power to get away with it. So that's not so good. The Me Too movement, I suspect it probably did some good things and some terrible things. So I would say that there's a dangerous proclivity to abandon the concept of the presumption of innocence. So in university campuses, for example, we're moving towards a preponderance of evidence model. I'm not very happy with that model. I think that's a very big mistake. The presumption of innocence is nothing short of a miracle, and we abandon it at our extreme peril. So I'm not happy with that. I think the believe the victim idea is something that only a fool could conjure up, because it opens the door to unbelievable opportunity for manipulation.
I think that I would disagree with you slightly on that, because I think what that means is what people are arguing for is don't instantly dismiss or disbelieve the victim, right? Which is a very different.
No, that's partly what they're arguing for. There's
thing.
Plenty of people who are arguing for the fundamental attitude to be believe the victim. So some people are arguing to not automatically disbelieve the victim, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to argue for, but that isn't where it ends. So
okay, climate change. I saw you posting a link to a study suggesting that a lot of the way that it's talked about has been overhyped. What are your beliefs about climate change?
Well, I spent a lot of time. I don't really have beliefs about climate change, I wouldn't say. I mean, I think the climate is probably warming, but it's been warming since the last ice age, so I don't know exactly what to make of that.
But it's dramatically accelerated even in the last couple of decades.
Maybe. Mm-hmm. And possibly. It's not so obvious. I spent quite a bit of time going through the relevant literature. I read about 200 books on ecological, what would you call it, on ecology and economy when I worked for the UN for about a 2-year period, and it's not so obvious what's happening, just like with any complex system. The problem I have fundamentally isn't really a climate change issue. It's that I find it very difficult to distinguish valid environmental claims from environmental claims that are made as a, what would you call it, secondary anti-capitalist front, essentially. So it's so politicized that it's very difficult to parse out the data from the politicization.
So I saw there was a line in 12 Rules which says people stricken with poverty don't care about carbon dioxide.
Yeah, that's definitely the case.
And I think that's not an unreasonable point to make, because you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? People, if you can't eat, then actually you can't really worry about what's happening in 50 years to the planet. However, I don't think that's a reason not to tackle climate change, because those same people in the global south...
It's partly a reason.
Is it though? Because people in the global south...
coal-generated plants stop people from starving. So yes, it's partly a reason. And it's certainly the case that making energy more expensive, obviously, makes things more difficult for poor people. So yes, it's definitely an issue. And I would say, it's kind of a conundrum for those on the left. It's like, what's it going to be? Clean air or hungry people? Think, well, we don't have to choose. It's like, okay.
Or renewable energy, or...
good luck with that.
Or nuclear power. I'd be fine with more nuclear power stations.
Yeah, well, it doesn't look like we're moving in that direction very fast.
No, but that is a solution.
Well, it worked for the French.
I was fascinated. David Attenborough is something kind of close to a national religion in Britain. So there's a bit where you say population control advocates like him, you compare them to Eric Harris, one of the Columbine killers. Why then is it virtuous to propose that the planet might be better off if there were fewer people on it? And I found that completely boggling, that you have elided their population control through people not being born and the mass slaughter of people who are already alive.
It's the motivation that I question.
Right. Tell me more about that.
Well, what kind of statement is the planet would be better off with fewer people on it? First of all, there's an easy solution to that. You could leave.
Unfortunately, much the best efforts of Elon Musk, that is not yet an option permanently.
No, that isn't what I mean. That's what I meant, yes. If you're very concerned about your carbon footprint, there's a very fast solution to that. So, and I think it's disingenuous to, it's the other people, or maybe it's the people who haven't been born yet. It's like, this is also the problem I have with much of the environmentalist movement, is there's a powerful stream of anti-human sentiment that motivates it, and masquerading under the guise of virtue on a planetary scale. It's like, could be. I mean, it's not like we're not fouling our own nest, But
that's why I'm fascinated by where you come from, is because the book, is so much about things being in balance and harmony, right? And order and chaos outweigh each other. Well, what overpopulation has done is got to the same point.
Who says we have overpopulation?
Well, I think that it's very difficult to see under the current model of fossil fuel-based capitalism. Sorry to use that word. I know it upsets you.
But that is what you would think.
Until we've run out of fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
Well, it will happen.
Yeah.
Because there is
people have been saying that's going to happen for 50 years, and now the United States is a net exporter of fossil fuel.
Right.
And so no one saw that coming, did they? But it happened.
And you're right, that might be the case, but at the moment I would say that China is putting up new coal-fired power stations by the bucket load. Yeah. It is entirely possible that the stuff that the developed nations did, that now developing nations did, and now doing to make themselves richer.
They'll get concerned about clean air when they get richer. That's what the data indicate. Once you get GDP up to about $5,000 per year, people start to become concerned with environmental issues. So if we make people rich fast enough, I don't think so. It'll happen too late for some things. It looks like we're going to top out at about 9 billion. I think we can handle that. I think probably one of the problems that'll beset us in 100 years, assuming there are even creatures like us around in 100 years, is that there'll be too few people, not too many. You know, the projections top out at about 9 billion. It's only 2 billion more than we have now. There's every reason to assume that we can cope with that, especially given the rapid decreases in poverty around the world at the moment. There's a bit of a bottleneck. There'll probably be some more extinction. What we're doing to the oceans by overfishing doesn't seem very smart. But we've only been aware of our role as planetary stewards since 1960, I would say. And we're not doing too bad for people who just woke up to the fact that we're actually a planetary force. And I don't think that we're overpopulated. I think all the arguments that all the people who made those arguments in the 1960s, like Paul Ehrlich, I think he wrote The Population Bomb, predicted mass starvation by the year 2000. He was absolutely and completely wrong.
No, we've been very lucky with things like golden rice, for example, and genetic engineering of crops. I think that's...
Yeah, it's not luck.
No, it is. I agree. Human ingenuity is a huge part of that, definitely.
Right. Well, and more people, more ingenuity. And Bjorn Lomborg, who I really admire, this skeptical environmentalist who's actually gone a very long ways to trying to figure out what we could do at a planetary level that would actually be useful and productive. His research has indicated the best possible investment isn't carbon tax, it isn't cessation of utilization of carbon-based fuel. It's probably investment in early infant care around the world, especially in developing countries. Seems right to me. He's done the analysis very carefully.
One more area that you've talked about that's caused controversy is gay parenting. You said the devil is in the detail and you want to see more studies on that. What do you think might be the adverse effects of having same-sex parents?
Well, I don't think we know what modeling is optimal for children. That's really the issue. I mean, I suspect that 2 parents are better than 1. Suspect, right? I don't know. 1 parent is definitely worse than 2. We know that. But we don't know what exposure to role models, say, is necessary for the continuity of maternal behavior or for the adoption of functional gender roles. We don't know any of that. And so that's the variable, obviously. No one knows what the consequence of being raised with 2 people of the same sex is. Maybe none.
But so there doesn't seem to be any evidence so far. That's all the literature review suggests that there were a couple that showed problems, but they were in coupledoms that had already broken down, right? So there is no evidence. Maybe there will be some found, but at the moment there is no evidence that there is any problem with having gay parents.
I never said there was. Somebody asked me, I believe it was a question like, if there was a problem, what would it be? It's something like that. I mean, you can make a very strong conservative case for gay marriage, I think. I mean, not that I would necessarily be motivated to make a conservative argument.
David Cameron, our former Prime Minister, said, I support gay marriage because I'm a conservative.
Yes, right. So, it's obviously homosexuality it's been around forever. So what's the appropriate social response to that? Well, conceivably, bringing as many people as possible into something approximating the same game. I think you could make a reasonable case for that. What's the consequence of that for children in those families? I don't know. I mean, what I would say is, well, the obvious risk is that there's no one of the opposite sex around. I mean, it doesn't take it doesn't take the perception of genius to come up with the observation that might be a problem. Now, maybe it's not. And my suspicions are there's probably far more relevant problems with regards to what happens to children that isn't good than that.
Right. So this is a way in which, that is now a conservative position to hold. I think it's 20 years ago that would have been anathema to mainstream conservatives.
Well, people were concerned with the deterioration of marriage and believed that any additional transformations would further weaken it. And I think that that's not an unreasonable position given how weak it's become. And I don't think that that's been good for people overall.
Okay, let's talk about free speech to finish on. You write in your book about Nietzsche, who became the Nazis' favourite intellectual, and you also talk about a professor...
Only through his sister's mistranslations of his work.
Right, but you talk a little bit as well about another professor whose ideas you thought led inevitably to kind of Maoism, and you said, I don't know how he can't be more worried about where his ideas lead. do you worry about where where your work might be taken and used by other people? I saw you posing with.
I worry about that all the time.
With a Pepe flag.
Oh, I can't believe you brought that up.
Right, but I just think it's
seriously. I can't believe you brought that up. You should go online.
Yeah, I do.
There's a
believe me, I do.
There's a video called, I think it's called, "Is Jordan Peterson a Darling of the Alt-Right?" Have you watched the video of the person who put up that Pepe flag with me? He's online. But go watch it.
I have seen. You wouldn't, I would say.
And why are you concerned about Pepe, anyways? Jesus, he disappeared like 3 years ago.
It is,
and most of that was trolling by young guys who were trying to drag the media into idiot accusations, like the idea that this was a white supremacist gesture, which I was asked about on CBC. It's like, no, it wasn't. It was Fortran trolls playing the media for fools, which worked. And much of the Pepe thing was that as well.
Okay, but the problem with people ironically pretending to be Nazis on the internet...
They weren't pretending to be Nazis.
But no, this is a separate phenomenon, and 4chan definitely do ironically pretend to be all of the worst things they can possibly be, is that some people take that very seriously. There was a case in America recently of a guy who stabbed his father because he had thought that his father was a Democrat. He was writing stuff for a conservative website. He'd got very into the Pizzagate conspiracy theory.
No, he's probably paranoid.
Right, so there are people who take this stuff very, very seriously, and they latch onto it.
What's your point?
I'm saying that, how much responsibility do you feel that you have, particularly guys to the alt-right, who, as you say, some of them have enjoyed your work, and say, I'm not one of you guys. I'm not with you guys.
They haven't enjoyed my work.
I've definitely read bits on the internet.
Read more.
Okay.
Find some evidence. I'm extraordinarily sick and tired of this particular accusation / line of questioning. I'm no fan of the identitarian right, the ethno-nationalists, the alt-right. First of all, what do you mean by alt-right exactly? Do you mean ethno-nationalists? Do you mean white supremacists?
No, I mean people who are on the right but have got their power base outside the traditional media. They see themselves as an alternative. So I see them coming up...
That's a pretty loose definition of the alt-right.
Rush Limbaugh kind of talk radio, right? People who see themselves in opposition to an establishment.
Rush Limbaugh is not the alt-right.
No,
he's been around for 30 years.
Right, so he's the progenitor of what I see now, Breitbart and things like that, are the new media version of that very old media
Well, let's
format.
define what constitutes alt-right first. For me, they're ethno-nationalists. They tend to be white supremacists. And generally, when people tar me with an alt-right epithet, the reason they're doing that is to associate me with those people. They don't like me. And the reason for that is that I've made it very clear, not only in my videos, but on Twitter, that I don't like them. I don't like their anti-Semitism. I don't like their use of identity politics. I don't agree with their aims. I think that their notion is something like, well, if everybody's going to play identity politics, we're going to play it too, and we're going to win. And I can certainly understand that motivation, but I think it's a bad game all around. And I think the only reason that I was ever associated in any sense whatsoever with anything to do with the alt-right was because it was extremely convenient of the radical leftists, who I fundamentally detest, to paint me as a representative of that viewpoint.
Right.
Other than that, zero. Now,
that's okay, but that's not what I did. You say so. At no point did I say you were.
Well, you brought up the whole Pepe thing.
But I did bring that up. But there was a reason I did that, which is that Nietzsche himself said, "I'm an anti-Semite," right? And yet his ideology and his philosophy ended up being used by the Nazis. So my question to you is, how much responsibility do you feel about the
it
way in which
what I
your
feel.
work
It's
is
not
used?
how much responsibility I feel. It's how much responsibility I take.
Right.
Right. And I take as much responsibility as I possibly can. Right. Which is why I'm doing what I'm doing. Right. I'm going around the world. I'm talking in different cities. I'm talking to people as much as I can. I'm putting out content that I think is useful for people online, and I'm clarifying what I think. I have 300 videos on YouTube. Virtually, for all intents and purposes, every single word I've said to students in a professional capacity since 1992. And despite the fact that I have innumerable, highly motivated enemies, they haven't been able to find one thing I've said in 30 years that, what would you say, justifies any of those accusations, or any other accusations for that matter. So it's quite the phenomena. I mean, I understand it to some degree, because...
So, sorry, about the Pepe flag, 'cause you can help me explain this. Why did you pose with it? What were your reasons for doing it? Did people just come up and bring it to you and
Yeah, I was like posing with... I've probably been photographed with, I don't know, 5,000 people in the last 2 years. And, it's one after the other, often in groups of 100, 150 or 200 people. And it's like 15 seconds.
Right.
And they brought this flag. One of them had spoken at the event. They were doing it ironically. They unfurled the flag, and we took a picture, and that was that.
Would you have posed ironically with a hammer and sickle flag?
I don't know under the circumstances what I would have done. I have all sorts of Soviet art in my house.
Right. Because this is, I think, anybody could get caught out, and social embarrassment is a huge factor, and you don't want to kind of tell people who've been very nice to you that actually you don't want to do the thing. I just wonder if that's something that you regret now, that you wouldn't do it again if you had the opportunity.
Well, I don't think it did me any good. I don't think I'll betray my former self. We'll just leave it where it is. I made the decision that I made under the circumstances and took what was there into consideration. I think that the peppy formulators did a wonderful job of trolling the standard media. I don't think that they were what everyone presumed them to be.
I think they did a wonderful job of trolling you as well, in a sense, right? Recruiting you and your image and your appeal to people to their kind of cause, which is ironic.
I don't really think so.
But is not actually. Underneath it all, I don't find it very ironic, actually.
What don't you find ironic?
That a lot of the kind of 4chan culture, which is saying, I'm just going to say the worst possible thing that I can say just to prove that I can say it because free speech is still alive. I think that in itself is quite poisonous to the discourse. I think I try and conduct myself online in a relatively civilized manner. I do not always succeed, but I do not think just going into a room and screaming epithets is something that I need to do on a daily basis to prove that free speech isn't dead, right?
I think we could probably agree that that's a reasonable
a rare note of consensus. But I have to come back to the free speech idea, because I think that whole idea of the intellectual dark web, and this came up a couple of times at your event on Thursday, is predicated on the idea that you have been marginalised for your opinions or oppressed for your opinions.
It's not predicated on my claim of that.
Right. It's predicated on...
Well, I don't know. I'm not claiming I've been marginalised. I would never use that word, first of all. That's for sure.
So, but the idea of a dark...
I don't feel oppressed.
Good. I'm pleased to hear it. But I do think that the way that you got the cheers from that crowd was very much about, there was an idea of taboo breaking, right? That this is a microaggression, but I'm going to say it anyway, that, hard work is the way to succeed. And I thought that was fascinating, because to me you don't look like somebody who has particularly suffered an outrageous amount for your opinions. People have certainly disagreed. They've been rude. They've in some cases.
The only reason I haven't suffered an outrageous amount for my opinions is because I've handled the consequence of their utterance exceptionally well. My job was at risk. My career was at risk. My family stability was at risk. So I wouldn't push that one too far.
In what way was your job at risk?
Jesus. Last year, 200 of my fellow faculty members signed a petition to get me fired. That was only one of a dozen things that happened. The university wrote me 2 letters, 2 cease and desist letters from their HR departments with their legal staff. 3 of those and you're done. They just fired Rick Maida in Canada at Acadia University for talking about many of the same things that I've talked about. So the fact that I've come through this relatively unscathed has very little to do with the vitriol of the attacks. There was plenty of motivation to take me out. It just didn't work.
Right. And I think the fact that it didn't work, to me, makes me ultimately optimistic about where we are, because
Why?
Because I went on, I did a panel a while ago with Zarganara, a Burmese comedian, who was imprisoned for making a joke, right? And we are not yet at that stage. I think, undoubtedly,
We're not. We're damn close.
Really?
How about the guy with the pug in the UK?
Count Dankula.
That's the one.
Right, but he did actually, that
was a joke. You might not have liked it. I didn't say it was a good joke. I didn't say it was an appropriate joke. I didn't say any of that. I didn't say it was a well thought through joke. But it was a joke.
Yeah, I just fundamentally don't believe that it was a joke. I believe that it was camouflaged as a joke, and that's what it kind of comes across.
Right.
And
Well, that's exactly what you would believe if you were inclined to persecute comedians.
No, I'm not inclined to persecute someone.
Well, you're inclined to persecute him.
I don't think he's a comedian, and I don't think I would have to go and look at the circumstances of that case. But I think
he didn't like his girlfriend's pug and thought he would teach it to do something reprehensible as a joke.
Right, but I see you getting involved, say, tweeting Douglas Murray's article about Tommy Robinson, and I think you see that as a free speech issue, and that's not how I see Tommy Robinson's case at all. I see that as contempt of court, someone who endangered a grooming trial. How do you see that case?
I see it as very fortunate that Tommy Robinson didn't die in prison.
I think I would say that about a lot of people in prison. I think it's very hard to be in prison if you are a sex offender, for example. I think our British prisons are less inhumane than American prisons, but they are still brutal places to be. However, I do think that was an appropriate punishment for somebody who tried to collapse a grooming trial.
Well,
but are you? And I guess are you a prison abolitionist?
no.
Oh right, okay. So you do believe that some people there are offences for which people need to go to prison.
Why would you ask me a question like that?
Well,
Do
I'm
I
just
look like
interested.
someone who isn't interested in meting out appropriate punishment?
No, but I just thought maybe I've made an assumption about you, and I didn't want to make an assumption about you. I'm just going to end with a quick fire round. So I know that this is YouTube, so we have been able to talk for a really long time, but I just want quick answers from you. Who is your favourite author?
Dostoevsky.
Who's your favourite female author?
Margaret Lawrence, I think.
I don't know her.
She's a Canadian author. Kind of an antidote to Margaret Atwood in my estimation.
Okay. When did you last cry?
Oh God, who knows? Last week, probably.
Who is your smartest opponent?
Sam Harris is pretty smart.
Because you've had debates about atheism with him and about rationality. And
Yeah, I don't really regard him exactly as an opponent. You know, I mean, we disagree on things. I don't really tend to think of people as opponents, generally. I mean, but Harris is smart. He's good at making his case, and so that's been interesting.
What big question don't you know the answer to?
What big question don't I know the answer to? Oh God, that's a tough one. There's so many of them. Well, personally, it's what I should do in 2 years.
When did you last change your mind about something important?
I'm changing my mind about things all the time.
But
Every time I do a lecture, I change my mind about something.
But something important, something big.
Oh, well, I can tell you. I mean, one thing I've learned in the last 2 years is that I think I overestimated. There's an obesity epidemic in North America, perhaps throughout the Western world. I think I overestimated the degree to which that was a consequence of a sedentary lifestyle, and overestimated the degree to which a lack of discipline was contributing to it. I think much more now that it's an illness.
Well, those are two different things though, aren't they? Discipline is self-control and illness is something out of your control.
Well, let's say you're overweight, you should exercise.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, actually the evidence that exercise will thin you down isn't that great. And maybe the reason that you're not exercising is because you're ill, not that you're ill because you're not exercising. So I have a lot more sympathy for the hypothesis that the obesity epidemic is actually a consequence of an illness, of a broad scale. Illness isn't exactly right. It's a dietary problem, fundamentally. There are deep causes for that.
Are you still eating your all beef diet?
Unfortunately, yes.
Really just beef? Not? Can you have like ketchup on it?
Nothing. Right. Yes, I wouldn't. It isn't something I would lightly recommend. It's a little hard on your social life. It makes traveling quite difficult, and it's dull as hell. But
what has it done for you?
Well, I lost 50 pounds in 7 months. I stopped snoring. I had some autoimmune conditions that seem to have gone away. I'm not taking antidepressants. My mood isn't perfectly regulated, but I'm under a fair bit of stress, so that might have something to do with it. I sleep much less. I can work more.
I imagine
I
your
don't have
arteries
GERDs.
might not be in great shape.
I don't think there's any evidence that I don't think we have any idea what causes arteriosclerosis. I think all of the dietary knowledge we have is rubbish. And partly because it's unbelievably difficult to do proper dietary studies. You can't do controlled studies. It's all correlational, and there's so many variables. I think the correlational studies are useless. So also this all meat diet, this all beef diet has apparently cured my daughter. So,
who had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis?
Well, that was the original diagnosis. Then it was idiopathic, which means we don't know what the hell's causing it. Yeah, but she's completely symptom-free. So that sort of thing makes you sit up and take notice because it doesn't make any sense.
When was the last time you lied? Because the book says no lying. Do you still lie?
Everybody lies.
As Dr. House himself told us. What is most important?
But I'm pretty damn careful about it.
What is most important to you in life?
Not being stupid.
How would your life...
Not making foolish mistakes. Not being incautious. Yeah.
That's tough on yourself.
Life's tough, man.
Right. How would your life have been different if you'd been born female?
Multiple orgasms.
It's not a bad one. What's your biggest regret?
That I didn't take advantage of the opportunity to learn to play the organ when I was 7.
If that's your biggest regret, that's going to be a great deathbed, because that's...
Yeah, well, you know, I would have liked... It would have been better for me if I would have been a better musician.
And finally, how would you like to be remembered?
As someone honest.
Dr. Jordan Peterson, thank you very much.